Have you ever noticed that your moments of greatest transformation often emerge from periods of complete disorder? That peculiar pattern isn't coincidental. Throughout history, we've been conditioned to fear chaos, to see disruption as something to be avoided at all costs. We crave stability, predictability, control. Yet there's something profoundly counterintuitive happening beneath the surface. Something that Friedrich Nietzsche recognized with startling clarity over a century ago. What if the chaos you've been taught to fear is actually the very source of your creative potential? What if disorder isn't working against you but is instead the raw material from which your greatest achievements will emerge? From chaos, stars are born, not from perfect order, not from careful planning, but from the wild, unpredictable energy of dissolution and reformation. Look around you at the natural world. A forest fire that appears catastrophic becomes the catalyst for new growth. The apparent violence of a volcano creates fertile new land. Even the formation of stars themselves requires the collapse and explosion of cosmic matter. This pattern repeats itself endlessly throughout the universe, creation emerging from destruction, order from disorder, form from formlessness. But we've been trained to resist this fundamental truth. We're taught that success comes from careful planning, from following established patterns, from maintaining control. And yet, when we examine the lives of history's most brilliant creators and innovators, we find something surprising. Almost universally, their breakthroughs emerged not from their moments of perfect order, but from periods of profound disruption. Nietzsche wasn't merely suggesting that we tolerate chaos. He was proposing something far more radical, that we celebrate it, embrace it, recognize it as sacred. One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star, he wrote. But what did he mean by this enigmatic phrase? And why has this insight been so carefully obscured from our everyday understanding? What if the most powerful creative force in the universe isn't methodical progress, but rather the unpredictable energy of disruption? What if your moments of greatest disorder aren't failures to overcome but essential stages in your evolution? Consider for a moment what happens when you face a major disruption in your life. A job loss, a relationship ending, a health challenge. The conventional wisdom tells us these are setbacks to be overcome, obstacles on our path to success. We're encouraged to get back on track as quickly as possible, to return to stability and predictability. Yet there's a curious pattern that emerges when we examine these moments more closely. Those periods of disorder often precede our most significant personal evolutions. The job loss that leads to discovering your true calling. The relationship ending that allows you to find yourself. The health challenge that transforms your priorities. Time and again, chaos precedes transformation. This pattern extends far beyond individual experience. Look at cultural and artistic movements throughout history. The Renaissance emerged from the chaos of plague and societal collapse. Jazz developed during periods of profound social disruption. The technological revolution we're living through today was born not from careful corporate planning, but from garage tinkerers and college dropouts breaking established rules. There's a revealing disconnect between what we're told about creation and what actually happens in practice. Our educational systems, corporate structures, and social institutions all emphasize linear progress, careful planning, and risk avoidance. Yet the evidence suggests something different. That breakthrough creativity requires a willingness to enter the unknown, to risk disorder, to embrace uncertainty. The ancient Greeks understood this paradox. Their creation myths didn't begin with careful design, but with chaos, a gaping void from which all existence emerged. Similarly, many indigenous cultures celebrate trickster figures, beings who create through disruption rather than order. Yet somewhere along the way, Western civilization developed an obsession with control, with eliminating uncertainty, with banishing chaos from our lives and our minds. This anomaly becomes particularly striking when we examine the creative process itself. Artists, writers, scientists, and innovators frequently describe their breakthroughs as emerging not from methodical planning, but from a disruptive insight, an unexpected connection, a moment when conventional thinking breaks down. The truly original doesn't come from following established patterns. It emerges when those patterns dissolve. What's more, our brains themselves seem designed to create through chaos. Neurological research reveals that creative insights often occur when our default neural pathways are disrupted, forcing new connections to form. The eureka moment doesn't happen when we're following familiar thought patterns. It happens when those patterns are interrupted, when disorder allows new possibilities to emerge. And yet, despite all this evidence, we continue to fear disorder, to pathologize uncertainty, to treat chaos as something to be eliminated rather than harnessed. We've created a society that values predictability over creativity, security over transformation, comfort over growth. This contradiction points to something profound about our relationship with creation itself. It suggests that we've fundamentally misunderstood what creation requires of us, and it raises a provocative question. What might be possible if we began to see chaos not as our enemy, but as our ally in the creative process? What hidden potential might you unlock if you stopped resisting the chaos in your life and began to recognize its creative purpose? Friedrich Nietzsche was no stranger to chaos. Born in 1844 in Prussia, his life was marked by profound disruption from the beginning. His father, a Lutheran pastor, died when Friedrich was just 5 years old, an event that would shake the foundations of his young life and plant the seeds of his later philosophical inquiries. What's particularly revealing is how Nietzsche's relationship with chaos evolved throughout his life. As a young scholar, he sought order and structure, excelling in his studies and becoming the youngest person ever appointed to a chair of classical philology at the University of Basel. He was, by all appearances, following a conventional path to academic success. But beneath this orderly exterior, something was stirring. Nietzsche found himself increasingly dissatisfied with the neat categories and systems of traditional philosophy. He began to sense that these carefully constructed intellectual frameworks were missing something essential about human experience, the raw, chaotic energy that drives creation and transformation. This intuition was reinforced by a pivotal relationship in Nietzsche's life: his friendship with the composer Richard Wagner. In Wagner's music, particularly his opera Tristan und Isolde, Nietzsche encountered a creative approach that embraced dissonance and disruption rather than conventional harmony. This musical chaos had a profound effect on the young philosopher, suggesting new possibilities for thought and expression. But perhaps the most significant encounter with chaos in Nietzsche's life came through his own body. At the age of 35, plagued by debilitating health problems including severe migraines, nausea, and deteriorating eyesight, he was forced to resign from his academic position. This physical suffering, rather than defeating him, became a catalyst for his most profound insights. During this period of personal turmoil, isolated and often in pain, Nietzsche began to develop the ideas that would define his philosophical legacy. It was precisely in this state of disruption, when his career, his health, and his social connections had all been thrown into chaos, that his most original thinking emerged. What makes Nietzsche's approach so remarkable is that he didn't merely theorize about chaos. He lived its transformative potential. His own creative breakthrough came not despite his suffering, but through it. The disorder of his life became the raw material for his philosophy. In his journal entries from this period, we can trace how Nietzsche began to see his suffering not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a necessary condition for his philosophical work. "To those human beings who are of any concern to me," he wrote, "I wish suffering, desolation, sickness, ill-treatment, indignities. I wish that they should not remain unfamiliar with profound self-contempt, the torture of self-mistrust, the wretchedness of the vanquished. I have no pity for them, because I wish them the only thing that can prove today whether one is worth anything or not, that one endures." This wasn't masochism or mere resignation to pain. Rather, it was a profound recognition that the dissolution of our comfortable patterns, even when painful, creates the conditions for new growth. Chaos breaks down our established limitations, forcing us to recreate ourselves. By 1883, when Nietzsche began work on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his most influential work, he had developed a completely different relationship with chaos than the one that dominated his culture. While European civilization was increasingly defining progress as the elimination of uncertainty, Nietzsche was recognizing chaos as the very source of creative transformation. What revelation about the nature of creation was Nietzsche discovering through his own lived experience with chaos? And why does this insight remain so challenging to our conventional understanding even today? The evidence for Nietzsche's radical insight begins with his most famous declaration: God is dead. This statement, often misunderstood, wasn't merely a rejection of religion. It was an acknowledgement that the traditional structures of meaning that had organized Western civilization were dissolving. The ordered worldview that had prevailed for centuries was giving way to a new period of uncertainty and potential chaos. While many of his contemporaries responded to this cultural shift with anxiety or nihilism, Nietzsche saw something different. In his work, The Gay Science, published in 1882, he presents this dissolution not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Indeed, we philosophers and free spirits feel, when we hear the news that the old God is dead, as if a new dawn shone on us. At long last, the horizon appears free to us again, even if it should not be bright. At long last, our ships may venture out again, venture out to face any danger. All the daring of the lover of knowledge is permitted again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. Perhaps there has never yet been such an open sea. This nautical metaphor is revealing. Nietzsche isn't merely suggesting that we tolerate the uncertain waters of a world without fixed meaning. He's celebrating the creative possibilities that open up when we venture into uncharted seas. The dissolution of old structures doesn't lead to emptiness, but to freedom. The freedom to create new values, new meanings, new ways of being. This insight is further developed in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Nietzsche introduces the concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit. The spirit first becomes a camel, dutifully carrying the weight of tradition. Then, it transforms into a lion, who destroys old values. But the final and most important transformation is into a child, who represents the creative spirit that can build something new from the ruins of the old. Significantly, the creative phase can only come after the destructive one, order emerging from chaos. Nietzsche's personal letters provide further evidence of how deeply he embraced this principle. Writing to his friend Franz Overbeck in 1883, he explains, "I have had such a terrible time of it in these past years that I really ought to feel grateful to them. My health has improved, but I have the feeling that I'm in a different climate, breathing a different air. Everything that doesn't kill me makes me stronger." This last phrase, now famously quoted but rarely understood in context, wasn't a mere platitude about perseverance. It was a specific insight about the relationship between chaos and creation. The disruption that doesn't destroy us completely serves as the catalyst for our evolution. We create ourselves anew, not despite challenges, but through them. Perhaps the most direct evidence comes from the aphorism that opened our investigation. One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. This statement appears in the prologue to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Nietzsche's character addresses the crowd in the marketplace. The context is crucial. Zarathustra is speaking about the potential for humanity to evolve beyond its current limitations, to give birth to something new. And the prerequisite for this creation is not order, but chaos. Nietzsche doesn't present chaos as something to merely endure or overcome on the way to creation. He presents it as the essential condition, the fertile soil from which new life emerges. Without internal chaos, the willingness to let our established patterns dissolve, no new creation is possible. But this raises a puzzling question. If the connection between chaos and creation is so fundamental, why has it been so consistently overlooked or actively suppressed in our understanding of the creative process? To understand why this fundamental insight about chaos and creation has been obscured, we need to examine the structures of power that shape our relationship with disorder. Throughout the development of modern society, there has been a consistent effort to eliminate unpredictability, to establish systems of control, to make human behavior and thought increasingly predictable and manageable. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's the explicit aim of many of our social institutions. Educational systems standardize learning, emphasizing conformity and reproducible results over creative disruption. Corporate structures value predictability and risk management over innovation and transformation. Even our approach to mental health often pathologizes states of uncertainty or internal conflict, rather than recognizing their potential creative value. Nietzsche saw this tendency clearly in his own time, describing it as the spirit of the last man, the human being who seeks comfort and security above all else, who avoids risk and challenge, who prefers a pleasant existence to a meaningful one. "No shepherd and one herd," he writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. "Everybody wants the same, everybody is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into a madhouse." What Nietzsche recognized was that this pursuit of perfect order and control doesn't lead to greater creativity or fulfillment. It leads to stagnation. A society that eliminates chaos also eliminates the conditions for genuine creation and transformation. We become increasingly comfortable but increasingly incapable of evolution. This insight is supported by examining how creative breakthroughs actually occur across various domains. In science, Thomas Kuhn's influential work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, demonstrated that major scientific advances don't happen through gradual, orderly progress, but through periods of crisis and paradigm shift, when the established order breaks down and creates space for new understanding. Similarly, in the arts, the most significant movements often emerge from periods of disruption and disorder. The Dada movement arose from the chaos of World War I. Abstract expressionism developed during the uncertainty of the Cold War. Hip-hop emerged from the urban disorder of the South Bronx in the 1970s. Time and again, we see that new forms don't emerge from perfect conditions, but from disruption of the established order. Even at the individual level, biographies of creative geniuses consistently reveal that their breakthroughs came during periods of personal turmoil. Einstein developed his theory of relativity while working as a patent clerk, isolated from the academic establishment. Van Gogh created his most powerful work during periods of psychological crisis. Steve Jobs founded Apple after dropping out of college and wandering through India. Nietzsche's own letters and journals reveal his growing understanding of how his personal suffering was connected to his creative output. In a letter from 1888, he writes, "My existence is a terrible burden. I would have abolished it long ago had I not been making the most instructive tests and experiments in matters of mind and morality precisely in this state of suffering and almost absolute renunciation." What he's describing here isn't just resilience in the face of difficulty. It's a recognition that his suffering, the chaos of his physical and psychological experience, was the laboratory in which his philosophical insights were developing. Without this chaos, his creation would have been impossible. This evidence points to a profound contradiction in our approach to creativity and growth. We claim to value innovation and transformation, yet we systematically eliminate the very conditions that make them possible. We've created a society that promises creative fulfillment while actively suppressing the chaos that creativity requires. Could it be that our fear of disorder is actually preventing our evolution, both individually and collectively? What might happen if we began to embrace chaos as Nietzsche did, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a necessary phase in the creative process? As we examine Nietzsche's insights about chaos and creation more deeply, a consistent pattern begins to emerge, one that applies not just to artistic creation, but to all forms of growth and transformation. This pattern can be observed across diverse domains, from personal development to cultural evolution, from biological systems to cosmological processes. The pattern follows a specific sequence. First, an established order reaches its limits. Then, a period of chaos or dissolution occurs. Finally, a new, more complex order emerges from this chaos. Crucially, the new creation isn't possible without the dissolution of the old. Chaos isn't a mistake in the creative process. It's an essential phase. Nietzsche articulated this pattern most clearly in his concept of amor fati, the love of fate. This wasn't merely a stoic acceptance of whatever happens, but an active embrace of all experience, including disruption and suffering, as necessary components of a creative life. In Ecce Homo, he writes, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, but love it." This radical affirmation includes embracing the chaotic, the difficult, the challenging, not just tolerating these experiences, but recognizing them as the very conditions that make creation possible. What appears as destruction is actually the beginning of a new creative cycle. We can see this pattern in how Nietzsche approached his own philosophical work. He didn't develop his ideas through systematic, linear argument, but through a more chaotic process of intuition, contradiction, and experimental thinking. His use of aphorisms, short, often paradoxical statements, was a deliberate embrace of a more disruptive form of philosophy, one that forces the reader into active engagement rather than passive reception. The pattern becomes even clearer when we examine Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, or overhuman, not a superhero, but a human being who has evolved beyond current limitations. This evolution doesn't happen through careful planning or gradual improvement, but through a willingness to enter chaos, to break down established values and create new ones. The path to becoming is through dissolution. This insight has profound implications for how we approach creativity and growth in our own lives. Most self-improvement methodologies focus on adding new habits, skills, or knowledge without first creating space for them. Nietzsche suggests the opposite approach, that real transformation requires a willingness to let parts of ourselves break down, to enter a state of productive chaos before new growth can emerge. The pattern extends to how we process emotional experiences. Contemporary psychology increasingly recognizes that avoiding difficult emotions or trying to maintain constant positivity doesn't lead to emotional health. Rather, the willingness to fully experience our emotional chaos, our grief, our anger, our confusion, creates the conditions for genuine healing and growth. Even in the natural world, this pattern is consistently visible. Ecosystems don't evolve through gradual, orderly progression, but through disruptions like fires, floods, or the introduction of new species. These chaotic events, while initially destructive, create the conditions for new adaptations and greater biodiversity. The forest fire that appears catastrophic becomes the catalyst for ecological renewal. What makes Nietzsche's insight so powerful is that he recognized this pattern not as an unfortunate reality to be tolerated, but as the fundamental mechanism of creation itself. Chaos isn't an obstacle to overcome on the path to creation. It's the essential precursor to all new growth. This understanding transforms how we might approach the disorder in our own lives. The job loss, the relationship ending, the health challenge, these aren't just unfortunate setbacks, but potential catalysts for our evolution, if we're willing to engage with them creatively rather than merely trying to restore the previous order. Does this mean we should seek out suffering or deliberately create chaos in our lives? No, that would be a misunderstanding of Nietzsche's insight. Rather, when chaos naturally arises, as it inevitably will, we can approach it not with resistance and fear, but with curiosity and creative engagement. What happens when we stop seeing the chaos in our lives as failure and start recognizing it as the raw material for our next creation? The implications of Nietzsche's insight about chaos and creation extend far beyond philosophical theory. They transform how we might approach every aspect of our lives. If chaos is indeed the necessary precursor to creation, then our relationship with uncertainty, disruption, and change requires radical reconsideration. At the personal level, this understanding invites us to approach life's inevitable disruptions with a different mindset. The loss of a job becomes not just a setback, but an opportunity to rediscover authentic work. The end of a relationship becomes not just a failure, but a chance to redefine how we connect with others. The health challenge becomes not just a limitation, but a catalyst for re-evaluating what truly matters. Nietzsche himself demonstrated this approach through his response to his deteriorating health. Rather than merely lamenting his physical suffering, he integrated it into his philosophical work, writing in The Gay Science, "I doubt that such pain makes us better, but I know that it makes us deeper." The chaos of his illness didn't improve him in any simple sense, but it created depth and dimension in his thinking that might otherwise have been impossible. This perspective transforms our understanding of mental and emotional struggles as well. Depression, anxiety, and other psychological challenges aren't merely disorders to be eliminated, but potentially meaningful experiences that, when engaged with creatively, can lead to profound growth. Nietzsche, who experienced significant psychological turmoil throughout his life, found that these states gave him access to insights unavailable to those living more stable, comfortable lives. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "The strength of a person's spirit would then be measured by how much truth he could tolerate, or more precisely, to what extent he needs to have it diluted, disguised, sweetened, muffled, falsified." This suggests that our capacity for growth is directly related to our willingness to encounter difficult truths without needing them to be made comfortable, to face the chaos, rather than insisting on premature order. At a societal level, this insight challenges our approach to education, work, and community. Our educational systems typically aim to eliminate uncertainty and unpredictability, training students to follow established patterns rather than develop comfort with creative chaos. What might education look like if it deliberately included periods of productive disruption, teaching students not just how to follow rules, but how to create meaningfully from disorder? Similarly, our approach to work often prioritizes predictability and control over creative disruption. We measure success by stability and growth by incremental improvement. But if Nietzsche is correct, true innovation requires a willingness to enter chaos, to disrupt established patterns, to embrace uncertainty. The most transformative businesses and organizations might be those that deliberately incorporate elements of creative disorder rather than seeking to eliminate unpredictability. Even our understanding of history takes on new dimensions through this lens. Historical periods that appear chaotic or destructive, revolutions, cultural upheavals, paradigm shifts, can be recognized not just as unfortunate disruptions, but as necessary phases in cultural evolution. The disorder that seems catastrophic in the moment may be the essential precondition for the next phase of development. Perhaps most profoundly, this understanding transforms our relationship with mortality itself. Death represents the ultimate chaos, the final dissolution of our established order. Yet from a Nietzschean perspective, this dissolution isn't merely an unfortunate end, but a necessary component of life's creative cycle. Our mortality isn't separate from our creativity. It's intrinsically connected to it. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "I love him who lives to know, and who wants to know, so that the overhuman may live someday." And thus he wants his downfall. The willingness to go under, to allow aspects of ourselves to dissolve, is presented not as defeat, but as the precondition for evolution. What if we approached all of life's challenges with this creative mindset, not seeking to eliminate chaos, but recognizing it as the fertile soil from which new growth emerges? How might this transform your response to the disorder in your own life? There's a deeper dimension to consider in our investigation of chaos and creation, one that Nietzsche recognized with remarkable clarity. The systematic suppression of chaos in our culture isn't merely a philosophical oversight or a practical preference for order. It's connected to fundamental power structures that shape how we live, think, and create. Nietzsche identified this dynamic in his analysis of what he called slave morality, a value system that emerges not from strength and creative affirmation, but from resentment of power. This morality, he argued, devalues precisely those qualities that enable creative transformation: strength, risk-taking, the willingness to break established patterns, the courage to enter chaos. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, "The noble type of man experiences itself as determining values. It does not need approval. It judges, what is harmful to me is harmful in itself. It knows itself to be that which first accords honor to things. It is value-creating." This noble morality isn't about domination, but about the courage to create new values, rather than merely following established ones, a process that necessarily involves disrupting the existing order. What Nietzsche recognized was that established power structures have a vested interest in preventing this type of creative disruption. When we fear chaos, when we pathologize uncertainty, when we seek constant comfort and security, we become easier to predict and control. Our creative potential, our capacity to disrupt established patterns and create new possibilities, becomes suppressed. This insight is eerily relevant to our contemporary situation. We live in a time of unprecedented efforts to eliminate unpredictability from human life. Algorithms predict our preferences and behaviors. Medications smooth out emotional fluctuations. Social media platforms create comfortable bubbles of agreement. Entertainment provides endless distraction from inner turmoil. All these mechanisms, while offering certain benefits, also function to suppress the creative chaos that Nietzsche identified as essential to human evolution. The result is what Nietzsche might call a profound falsification of the creative process. We're told that creation happens through careful planning, through following established methods, through maintaining perfect control. The messy, chaotic reality of creative transformation is sanitized and rendered palatable. We're offered a version of creativity that never threatens the established order. This sanitization appears in how we present the lives of creative geniuses. Their struggles, their periods of chaos and dissolution, their breaks with convention are often minimized in favor of a narrative emphasizing their eventual success and recognition. We celebrate the finished masterpiece, but ignore the chaotic process that produced it. Even more tellingly, we pathologize those who embrace creative chaos too fully. The artist whose lifestyle is unconventional, the thinker whose ideas disrupt established patterns, the individual whose emotional life doesn't conform to stable norms. These people are often marginalized, medicated, or dismissed as unstable. The implicit message is clear. Creativity is acceptable only when it doesn't fundamentally threaten the established order. Nietzsche himself experienced this marginalization. During his lifetime, his work was largely ignored or dismissed as the product of an unstable mind. It was only after his death that his philosophical contributions began to be recognized, when they could be safely contained as historical artifacts, rather than living challenges to the status quo. The conspiracy isn't coordinated by any central authority. It's embedded in the very structures of our society, in our educational systems, our economic models, our psychological frameworks. These structures consistently privilege stability over transformation, predictability over creative chaos, comfort over growth. The result is a profound limitation of human potential. When we fear chaos, when we're taught to see uncertainty, disruption, and dissolution as purely negative, we cut ourselves off from the very source of our creative power. We remain comfortable but stunted, secure but unable to evolve. What if the greatest conspiracy isn't some hidden plot, but the systematic suppression of your creative potential through the demonization of chaos? What if you've been taught to fear the very thing that would catalyze your evolution? Why has this fundamental insight about chaos and creation been so consistently obscured? The reasons extend beyond simple power dynamics into the very structure of our civilization, into what Nietzsche identified as a profound conflict of values that has shaped Western culture for millennia. In The Birth of Tragedy, one of his earliest works, Nietzsche introduces the distinction between the Apollonian and Dionysian principles in Greek culture. Apollo represents order, clarity, individuation, and rational thought. Dionysus represents chaos, ecstasy, dissolution of boundaries, and instinctual energy. Nietzsche argued that Greek tragedy achieved its greatness through the balance of these opposing forces, the Dionysian chaos providing the raw creative energy, the Apollonian order giving it form and structure. However, with the rise of Socratic rationalism and later Christian morality, Western culture increasingly privileged the Apollonian while suppressing the Dionysian. Order, clarity, and rationality became virtues, while chaos, ecstasy, and dissolution became vices. This wasn't merely an aesthetic preference, but a profound moral judgment. Chaos became associated with evil, with sin, with all that should be overcome in human nature. We can trace this suppression through history. Medieval Christianity equated order with divine goodness and chaos with demonic influence. The Enlightenment further privileged rational order over instinctual chaos. The Industrial Revolution demanded predictable human behavior to accommodate mechanical production. Each of these developments, while bringing certain benefits, contributed to a progressive devaluation of chaos and its creative potential. What makes this suppression so effective is that it operates not just through external prohibition, but through internalized values. We learn to fear our own internal chaos, our contradictory desires, our disruptive emotions, our unconventional thoughts. We police ourselves, suppressing the very energies that might fuel our creative transformation. Nietzsche saw this self-suppression as a form of illness, a turning against life itself. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he writes, "There is perhaps nothing more terrible in man's earliest history than his mnemotechnics. Man could never do without blood, torture, and sacrifices when he felt the need to create a memory for himself. All this has its origin in the instinct that realized that pain is the most powerful aid to mnemonics. What he's describing is how we've been trained, through punishment and pain, to remember the rules, to stay within established boundaries, to fear the chaos of our own nature. This training runs so deep that it feels natural, inevitable. We mistake our cultural conditioning for biological necessity. The cover-up is particularly effective because it presents itself as protection. We're told that chaos is dangerous, that disorder leads to suffering, that unpredictability threatens our well-being. And there's a partial truth here. Chaos can indeed be threatening. What's concealed is the other side of the equation, that chaos is also the source of our creative power, that without it, we remain safe but stagnant. This concealment serves established interests. Religious institutions maintain authority by positioning themselves as sources of order in a chaotic world. Governmental structures justify control as necessary protection from disorder. Economic systems demand predictable behavior for efficient functioning. Educational institutions reproduce established knowledge rather than fostering disruptive creativity. Even our language reveals this bias. We describe chaotic periods in positive terms only after they've been resolved, as necessary challenges or growth opportunities. While in the midst of chaos, we have few positive words for the experience. Our vocabulary itself makes it difficult to value the dissolution phase of the creative process. Perhaps most tellingly, we've developed elaborate psychological frameworks that pathologize creative chaos. States of uncertainty, internal conflict, or heightened emotion are often labeled as disorders requiring correction rather than potentially valuable phases in a creative process. The person experiencing profound transformation may be diagnosed as unstable rather than evolving. Nietzsche himself was posthumously diagnosed with various psychological conditions, his philosophical insights often dismissed as symptoms of mental illness. This pattern continues today. Those who embrace creative chaos too fully often find themselves marginalized, medicated, or institutionalized. The ultimate effectiveness of this cover-up is that it makes us complicit in limiting our own potential. We learn to fear our internal chaos, to avoid disruption, to seek comfort over transformation. We become willing participants in suppressing our creative power. What if the greatest obstacle to your evolution isn't external limitation, but your own learned fear of chaos? What if you've been taught to reject the very force that would catalyze your transformation? The final question isn't whether chaos plays a role in creation. The evidence for this is overwhelming. The question is whether you're willing to develop a new relationship with the chaos in your life, to recognize it not as failure, but as the necessary precursor to your next evolution. What Nietzsche offers isn't just a philosophical theory, but a profoundly different way of living, one that embraces the full spectrum of experience, including disruption, uncertainty, and dissolution. This approach doesn't guarantee comfort, but it opens the possibility for authentic creation and transformation. The practical implications are both challenging and liberating. When you face periods of disorder in your life, whether professional disruption, relationship challenges, or internal confusion, you have a choice. You can view these experiences through the conventional lens, seeing them as failures to be overcome as quickly as possible. Or you can approach them with creative curiosity, recognizing that this chaos may be preparing you for a new phase of growth. This doesn't mean passively accepting whatever happens or glorifying suffering for its own sake. Nietzsche wasn't advocating for a masochistic embrace of pain, but for a creative engagement with the full spectrum of experience. The chaos itself isn't the goal. The goal is what might emerge from it if approached with creative intention. In practice, this means developing what we might call creative resilience. Not just the ability to return to your previous state after disruption, but the capacity to create something new from the experience. It means asking different questions when facing chaos. Not just, how can I get back to normal? But, what might this experience make possible? Not just, how can I minimize this pain? But, how might this challenge transform me? Nietzsche himself modeled this approach through his writing. His aphoristic style, his willingness to contradict himself, his embrace of paradox. All these qualities reflect a thinker who wasn't seeking to create a neat, orderly philosophical system, but to provoke creative disruption in his readers. His works don't offer comfortable answers, but catalyze new questions, new possibilities, new modes of thinking. This approach requires courage, the courage to face uncertainty without premature resolution, to allow old structures to dissolve before new ones form, to enter the unknown without guarantees. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "Indeed, we philosophers and free spirits feel, when we hear the news that the old God is dead, as if a new dawn shone on us. At long last, the horizon appears free to us again, even if it should not be bright." The death of old certainties, whether religious, philosophical, or personal, isn't simply loss, but the opening of new creative possibilities. The horizons may not be clearly illuminated, but they are free, open to new exploration, new creation, new becoming. I've noticed in my own exploration of this topic that those who most fully embrace this perspective share a quality that might be called creative faith. Not faith in any external power, but in the creative potential of life itself. They trust that dissolution can lead to new creation, that death contains the seeds of rebirth, that chaos carries creative possibility. If you've recognized this pattern in your own life, if you've experienced how periods of disruption often precede your most significant growth, I invite you to share that insight in the comments below. Your experience might illuminate the path for others facing their own creative chaos. And if this perspective has shifted how you view the challenges in your life, consider leaving a like as a signal that you're part of this community of philosophical investigators who are willing to look beneath conventional wisdom to discover deeper truths. The community we're building here isn't just about passive consumption of ideas, but about active engagement with life's fundamental questions. By subscribing and activating the notification bell, you're joining a group of modern Nietzscheans who aren't satisfied with comfortable answers, but are willing to enter the creative chaos where genuine transformation becomes possible. Remember Nietzsche's profound insight. One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. The chaos you're experiencing isn't working against you. It's what's making you shine. From chaos, stars are born. The question is, will you embrace the creative potential of your disruption, or will you continue to fear the very force that might catalyze your transformation?